Welcome to an unscheduled episode of Tisky Sour to welcome our new sociopathic overlord into Downing Street. Yes, one has been replaced by another. To discuss what we've learnt on the day Liz Truss became Prime Minister, I'm delighted to be joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
Michael, I'm very well. It's very good to have you back in the hot seat. I've got the easy job for once.
Well, I have to say you did the job very good yesterday. Thank you for that. You've been covering a lot for me lately. We've got a lot to get through today. Two inspirational speeches from Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. You will see the best of both. We do want to know throughout the show what you think about today's events. Will Liz Truss be even worse than Boris Johnson? Tell us on the hashtag Tisky Sour or in the comments. After flying to Balmoral and back to see the Queen, Liz Truss is now our Prime Minister. This was her speech on the way into Downing Street.
We will transform Britain into an aspiration nation with high-paying jobs, safe streets, and where everyone everywhere has the opportunities they deserve. I will take action this day and action every day to make it happen. United with our allies, we will stand up for freedom and democracy around the world, recognising that we can't have security at home without having security abroad. As Prime Minister, I will pursue three early priorities. Firstly, I will get Britain working again. I have a bold plan to grow the economy through tax cuts and reform. I will cut taxes to reward hard work and boost business-led growth and investment. I will drive reform in my mission to get the United Kingdom working, building and growing. We'll get spades in the ground to make sure people are not facing unaffordable energy bills, and we will also make sure that we are building hospitals, schools, roads and broadband. Secondly, I will deal hands-on with the energy crisis caused by Putin's war. I will take action this week to deal with energy bills and to secure our future energy supply. Thirdly, I will make sure that people can get doctor's appointments and the NHS services they need. We will put our health service on a firm footing. By delivering on the economy, on energy and on the NHS, we will put our nation on the path to long-term success. We shouldn't be daunted by the challenges we face. As strong as the storm may be, I know that the British people are stronger. Our country was built by people who get things done. We have huge reserves of talent, of energy and determination. I am confident that together we can ride out the storm. We can rebuild our economy and we can become the modern, brilliant Britain that I know we can be. This is our vital mission to ensure opportunity and prosperity for all people and future generations. I am determined to deliver. Thank you.
So that was Liz Truss on the way into Downing Street. Aaron, it was fairly underwhelming, wasn't it? It wasn't particularly flamboyant. The three priorities, she said, will be her immediate concerns. I don't think will surprise anyone. The energy bills, we're going to talk about that in more detail in a moment. And then she's also got tax cuts to bring about growth and trying to make it quicker for us to go to our GPs, even though I think one of the first things she said about the NHS is that she's going to take away a load of money from the NHS and give it to social care. Obviously, I'm in favour of giving money to social care. Taking away money from the NHS to cut GP queues, I'm less sure about. What did you make of it?
I thought it was adequate. It was short. Nobody really cares about political theatre right now, Michael, because the political moment is so extraordinary with the energy bills, with war in Ukraine, with just a sense of national crisis, with trade unions and rising industrial action and strikes and so on. I think there's so much political theatre anyway. You don't need to confect that and manufacture that from 10 Downing Street. And I think that's something that a lot of the instant analysis that I've seen, particularly from the left, centre left, doesn't seem to get. She wasn't there to sort of do, the Gettysburg Address or offer Churchillian rhetoric about national redemption. I think the one thing Liz Truss has going for her is low expectations. We talked about this poll yesterday on the show. 2% of the public, 2% think she'll be a great PM. 2%. So she shouldn't lean into inspiring, lofty rhetoric. The best days are ahead of us, all this stuff. I thought what she did was adequate, 7, 8 out of 10. And I thought the keywords, building, spades in ground, energy bills, GP appointments, very memorable. She is not a politician who's interested in theatre. And I think, again, what our critics don't quite get is that over the next week, we're going to see a blitz on policy, a blitz. And it's going to make the news. It's going to grab the headlines. You're not going to grab the headlines through like being slick and smooth and some great speech and some bit of oratory. You're going to grab the headlines because you're outlining really decisive action on energy bills and more besides. In the longer term, of course, yes, it's a different story. Then you have to be good at the political theatre stuff. But I think in the short term, she probably doesn't need that. She needs to bat away a series of really big problems. So for me, perfectly adequate, 7.5 out of 10.
Well, I think this week is going to be a lot about energy bills. I do think the NHS, though, has been a little bit underrated as a political issue over the past few weeks. I mean, the amount of time people are waiting to see their GPs, the fact that every aspect of the health service just seems to be collapsing, that to me seems like potentially a bigger danger than energy bills for Liz Truss, because I don't see how she has any answer whatsoever. She says, I'm going to make sure you don't have to wait for your GP as long as you currently do, which, yeah, she's talking about the right things. That is what people watching that will care about alongside their energy bills. But there doesn't seem to be any plan, unless she's really kept that one up her sleeve.
There's two sort of geometries going on here. You've got the geometry or the sort of political calculus of 2022, which I think is really straightforward. And I talked about that policy blitz. It's going to be relating to that. It's going to be talking about energy. And then you've got the longer term stuff, which they're really excited about big, deep structural reforms, the labour market, destroying workers' rights, doing all the sort of right-wing libertarian stuff they dreamed about in Britannia Unchained, Thatcherism on steroids, particularly outside the EU. Now, you're really right to highlight healthcare because it's possibly the only issue which striates both of those two things. The NHS and healthcare is a massive long-term challenge for every country, including us. But you're right to say that in the short term, ambulance waiting times, Michael, the target is 18 minutes. I think last month they were 59 minutes. Like you say, waits for A&E, waits for non-essential surgery. It's just a free fall right now in the NHS, particularly since 2020. And I think it is, you have to accept that particularly since COVID, it was really bad before then. We've had one direction of travel since 2010 and austerity, but it's elevated to a whole new plane since COVID. And I think you're right to isolate healthcare because that's the one which doesn't really fall into this easy binary of, okay, short term, let's do this, long term, let's do this. Because you're right, people have expectations around healthcare this winter. If it falls apart, it doesn't matter if you nail energy bills. It doesn't matter if all of a sudden, people think they've done the best they can. And that'll win her a lot of political capital, by the way. But that can disappear very quickly if, like you say, we have images of a national health system falling to pieces, which is very, very possible.
Let's move on to energy bills because that's a big policy development we have had today. So the most pressing task in Liz Truss's in-tray will be to protect UK households and businesses from eye-watering energy bills. And while an official announcement isn't expected until Thursday, we're already getting a clear idea of her plans. The BBC report that typical annual bills for households are set to be frozen at £2,500. Now, that's still an increase from now and significantly higher than this time last year, but it is lower than the £3,500 that would come into force next month without any intervention, and it would be expected to go much higher than that in the months to come as well. And this was the key development today. So it's now being briefed that all this will be paid for with government borrowing. That's a shift from earlier briefings, which suggested the cost could be added to future energy bills, with customers paying off debts over the next 10 to 20 years. So as I say, this seems to be very much changing. This morning, they were totally briefing what they're going to do is lend some money to the energy companies, and that will be paid back by a levy that customers have to pay. I think they realised from the reaction that really wasn't going to give Liz Truss the popularity boost she wanted. So it's going to come out of borrowing. And the package is set to cost around £100 billion. There are also briefings that the government is set to propose a further £40 billion package to help businesses. So on that front, Bloomberg report this. Truss is considering two options, one of which is a cap on firms' energy costs similar to a proposal that would protect British households. The other option is a percentage or unit price reduction that all energy suppliers must offer companies, according to documents seen by Bloomberg. The government would reimburse energy suppliers for their losses under the plans, and the price of energy charged to businesses would be reviewed quarterly. Very small businesses could receive even more help, possibly in the form of a lower price cap. Ministers have a key objective to give local firms such as fish and chip shops and independent pubs the same protection as households, the documents said. So if true, and if they can make this work, that will be, of course, a massive relief to businesses facing skyrocketing bills. The cost of all of this, though, is enormous. So the bill for both plans looks set to be around £140 billion. For context, £130 billion is the annual budget of the NHS, and furlough cost £70 billion. Now, Aaron, this is notable because it's very different from everything that Liz Truss was saying in her leadership campaign. Then she wasn't particularly interested in the cost of living crisis at all. Now, it seems she's ready to borrow twice the amount that we paid for furlough, a whole annual budget for the NHS, and put it purely to keeping energy bills both for consumers and for businesses down. Worth noting, they won't be particularly low. They'll still be a lot higher than they were last year, but they will be a lot lower than they would have been if there were no intervention. What's your take on what we've come to understand today she will likely be announcing on Thursday?
What's my take? Well, my take is, first of all, Michael, this is, as you've portrayed through the furlough comparison, an enormous intervention. I saw one number saying if it was over 18 months, to cap it at today's prices, it would be about 130 billion. That may not be needed. I mean, it may be longer than 18 months. After all, we had Ben Wallace, the defense minister, saying at the weekend that Putin's war on the West would last a decade. So, 18 months, it's pretty wise to budget for that. That's 130 billion. The proposed cuts to VAT may or may not happen. Let's see this tax package coming out on September 21st, apparently. That's 40 billion. Then you've got the scrapping of the national insurance contribution increase. You've got the scrapping of the corporation tax increase, which was going to be coming in and was initiated by Rishi Sunak as Chancellor. You're looking potentially at 200 billion here. You're looking at enormous figures, Michael. And like you say, right now what's being touted is circa 150 billion. But I think that it's probably going to be significantly more than that, probably. Now, for context, the German package, which was announced by Olaf Scholz over the weekend, was 65 million euro, about 52 million pounds. So you're looking at least £150 million package, although to be fair, that's longer than a year. Like I said, it's for 18 months on the energy fixed price issue versus circa 50 billion from the Germans. So it is an enormous intervention. And I just find it so strange that under Rishi Sunak, a committed free marketeer, you have, like you say, furlough, this massive government intervention. You're now seeing something similar with Liz Truss 2 years later. Again, a massive government intervention. When are Tories going to sort of say to themselves, you know what, actually the state is quite useful for things? And when are they going to stop sort of looking at these moments as just individualized, exceptions of necessity? We had a similar thing in 2007-8 with bailing out the banks. Like I say, we had something similar with the moment of crisis with COVID, and now we're seeing it with energy bills this year. Why don't we have the same mantra, the same approach to solve, I would argue, equally similar challenges, like the housing crisis, like rapid decarbonisation, like the fact that we've had awfully stagnant productivity. The amount of value created per person per hour worked basically hasn't moved for 14 years. Why can't the state invest in those things? But no, it's always about, this edgiest seat, you're sort of squeaky bum time. You've got this awful crisis coming down the road, whether it's COVID with a banking crisis or now with energy bills. And that's when the state's useful. Maybe they should kind of incorporate that in their worldview more generally. Might help.
Well, I was thinking about what this says about their worldview, this huge sum of money. And I think it looks a bit like Republican politics in the United States. So I suppose because of Cameron and Osborne, we sort of associated the Conservative Party with trying to cut deficits. Obviously, they never really managed it because it was such a self-defeating policy, because growth was so stagnant that even though they were cutting public services to the bone, it didn't bring the debt down. But put that to one side. ideologically, rhetorically, you expect the Conservatives to be the party of fiscal responsibility. That's not the case in the United States. I mean, every now and again, you get sort of Republicans who say, we need to get the debt down. But ultimately, George W. Bush massively increased the deficit. Donald Trump did exactly the same. And that's because they do two things, which is they cut taxes on businesses and then they print loads of money, mainly in corporate welfare, and then a little bit here and there to try and win support. So Donald Trump, one of the things he did was massively cut taxes for most people, actually. It did give him a popularity bounce. It probably would have re-won him the presidency were it not for COVID-19. He didn't give a damn about the deficit, right? So traditionally conservatives are supposed to say, we really care about this. But what he realized, and I think what Truss and Kwarteng are realizing, is that it doesn't really matter that much. You've got an election in a year and a half's time. If you want to get elected then, what you want to do is please your base with some tax cuts. That's what they're doing. And then print a bunch of money to put in people's pockets so they don't have to deal with these higher energy bills. Now, what Rishi Sunak would say is, this is going to be very inflationary. I assume what they're hoping is because, one element here is to cap energy prices. That will bring inflation down somewhat. But they're going to go massively into debt, which, I'm all in favor of here. But the key part of it, why it's still consistent with conservatism and why it looks a lot like what you'd also get in the United States with the Republicans, is that it doesn't touch corporate power one iota. So the big difference between this policy platform from the Conservatives, or as we currently understand it to be, and the Labour one is not radical. They're not going for nationalisation, but at least they were going for a windfall tax on the energy companies. What the Conservatives seem to be proposing to do is to leave everything exactly as it is, let the energy companies continue to profiteer throughout this crisis, but they're going to print the money, borrow the money, and give it to them. So they're protecting the profits of the energy companies, but making sure that the amount to which ordinary people have to pay in the short term is somewhat capped, because they essentially know that if they weren't to intervene on such a massive scale as this, they would 100% lose the next election. So to me, Aaron, this seems like what they are doing is the bare minimum they can do to give them some chance at the next general election, while not in any way at all questioning or challenging the power of corporate Britain. I don't know, is that your take? Do you think I'm on the right track here?
I have to push back a little bit. I think you're right that it's basically taking from, like you say, the Republican playbook. And the only sort of conservatives who actually take deficits seriously, it seems, are the Germans. And of course, they've infused the logic of this when it comes to the European Union. You have to run a deficit no larger than 3%. The austerity that was imposed on Greece, for instance, was one example. But in defense of the Germans, they kind of do that to themselves as well. They're obsessed with fiscal prudence. So like you say, the Brits and the Americans are a little bit different. But cast your mind back to the early 1990s. You have a big recession, of course, in early 90s, high interest rates. You have massive levels of house repossessions compared to what we've seen ever since. You have Black Wednesday, this kind of this nadir for British conservatism, and the idea that the Tories are strong on the economy, and you don't get deficit funded spending. What you actually see all the way through from 92 to 97 is actual real consolidation on the budget, Michael. And actually the few surpluses we have run in the last 25 years or whatever, actually I think 2 or 3 of them came under Ken Clarke and John Major. So there is something of a tradition in living memory of conservatives actually walking the walk on this. But again, to go back to it, Michael, you're right. Spending lots of money is popular, and ultimately these people want to be popular and want to win elections. That's absolutely true. But these are people who are committed to free market principles. People like Sajid Javid, Michael, who read Ayn Rand he reads Ayn Rand to his wife every year. These are ideological zealots and fanatics. When you look at the cost of the COVID intervention, you look at the cost of this intervention, it's enormous. They both are going to put the financial crisis in the shade. And I think that's a really interesting moment. And I think, for people younger than us in particular, who are 30 years old, they've only known right-wing governments. Yeah, sure, they say one thing, but they spend a shed load of money. So what does it augur? What does it mean for the future of conservative thinking? And I think, to finish, what you see repeatedly is, we'll address this problem now, but in the long term, of course, we have to run surpluses and we have to balance the budgets and be, economically austere. Tomorrow never comes, the whole thing of mañana, let's do it. But actually, at the end of the day, that's never delivered. Whether that's Osborne, like you say, they tried to do it, by the way. They were saying, we'll get rid of the deficit by 2015. We're still running a deficit. It's 2022. So that never comes anyway. But I do wonder at the sort of ideological, theoretical level, will they sort of question that? Because these people ultimately, Michael, they want to build things. They want to look serious. They want to be remembered in 100 years' time. Boris Johnson was very good at this, right? They want to, compete in the world, particularly geopolitically, militarily, with the Russians, with the Chinese. That takes money. And so I do wonder, like, if you're a Tory and you thought basically that the state is bad for 25 years and that you have to be very austere and you can't spend deficits, and all of a sudden you're seeing all this and thinking, well, Russia's on the rise, China's on the rise, let's double military spending. Why not? If that's the thing you care about. I do think that will come to the fore with the Conservative Party over the next 5 years, Michael. I think that will be a thing. We're going from this as exceptional action to normal. And I think for the cohort of Tory MPs elected in 2019, in particular, infused with that kind of Johnsonian populism and seats the Tories haven't really won for 30, 40 years, I think that's going to be a very important lesson for them. They will not be worried about spending and about deficits. And we may see actually Labour being the party at the next general election who are talking about deficits and austerity and living within our means. Could be a very interesting inversion of what we saw in 2019.
I mean, and that is the American model, right? Because I think in the United States, it was sort of Bill Clinton was the only one who'd been running surpluses for a while. Does all of this stuff to try and say, oh, I'm the fiscally responsible guy, runs a load of surpluses. George W. Bush comes in and just spends it all on tax cuts in the military. So it's a bit of a waste of time to do that, even if you are someone on the centre-left who believes in the importance of running surpluses. Obviously, you don't really need to do that in the United States or the United Kingdom because people are going to be willing to lend to us anyway. Big, powerful economies. Lots of people use the dollar. Lots of people use the pound. There's not going to be a run on it. They've finally realized this. They probably always knew it all along, but that was just a useful lie so they could attack the social rights of everyone in this country. Now they have decided they need to print the money because otherwise they're going to lose the next election. We have some breaking news. I have to say none of it is particularly surprising, but it is now official, at least. These are some cabinet appointments which Liz Truss has made. So as Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. We have known this for a long time. Health Secretary and Deputy PM will be Therese Coffey. Foreign Secretary will be James Cleverly. And Suella Braverman will be the Home Secretary. Aaron, as I say, no particular surprises there. The other news when it comes to the reshuffle is that Raab, Steve Barclay and Grant Shapps have all been sacked and none of them will have a different position. So basically, none of the Sunak backers are going to get good jobs, and the people who we have understood for a while will be getting these top jobs have got them. Do any of those people stand out to you? Kwarteng, Coffey, Cleverly, Braverman?
Not especially. I mean, Braverman and Kwasi Kwarteng, I think Kwasi Kwarteng was one of the Britannia Unchained people, of course, this book, which was outlining radical free market ideas, God knows how long ago now, 10, 12, 15 years ago. Kwasi Kwarteng's a very sharp guy. And actually, he wrote for the Financial Times on Sunday, I believe, Michael, saying that, look, we're not really worried about the debt and we'll happily run deficits. He was kind of just, he was signaling to the establishment, we won't intervene in Bank of England independence. There is clearly a faction within sort of the people backing Truss who probably would quite like to do that. He said, we won't. You will get those tensions in a project like Liz Truss's. It's not an establishment project within the Tory party. Bear in mind, only around 30% of Tory MPs backed her at the last time of asking in, was it June, July? So you're going to get those tensions. This is to an extent, an outsider project, to an extent. Bear in mind, this was the party of, Cameron, Osborne, all the way through to 2019, really, in terms of the MPs and their ideas and so on and so forth. I think, austerity is the default. The state can't really do very much was the sort of background. And I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation, actually, in terms of policymaking and strange ideas, like ending neutrality for the Bank of England. Not been talked about for a long time. Worth having a conversation over at least. So he wrote that for the Financial Times, and I think that establishes him as a serious person and a serious player within the Truss team. The fact that he's the person that's, the loudspeaker to the establishment. And it is, again, remarkable. Like I say, right now, public debt in this country is around 95% of GDP. It was 60% in 2010, but apparently that was a national emergency, and he's saying, look, compared to our competitor nations, the United States, Japan, Germany, we've got actually quite low public debt. I mean, Japan's got 200% debt to GDP ratio. So the argument is presumably we can go much higher. I don't think they'd want to go that high, but you could get to 120, 130%, and I think they'd be perfectly fine with that, which is a lot of money. And I think actually people on the left should pay attention to that. Finally, on the losers, I think if Truss has any sense, she'll crush them. That's what you have to do with. That's what you have to do with them in the situation she finds herself in. She won less than 60% of the membership. She won, like I say, less than a third of her colleagues at the final time of asking before it went to the membership. So her internal position is quite precarious. Rishi Sunak's not in cabinet. Obviously, he came second, was quite close. She's the first leader in the last 5 times who didn't get 60% or more of the membership. Of course, you've got Boris Johnson, who still thinks he can return to frontline politics. More on him in a moment. So I think given the precarious nature of her situation, not just in the national context with policy and the energy crisis, etc., internally too, I think she's going to have to really teach those guys a lesson. Maybe 1 or 2 are allowed back in the fold once they bend the knee. She has to show she's strong very, very quickly. So to be expected, I think.
Do you think what this day has suggested is that Liz Truss and her people actually have better judgment than Rishi Sunak and his people? I mean, if you think of all the false starts that Rishi Sunak had when it came to sort of trying to give people support when it comes to the energy crisis, I mean, he was always so resistant to just spending loads of money and capping the prices, the kind of thing that people will notice. This policy will be incredibly popular. Because people don't really care if they're borrowing a load of money to do this, because no one's going to politicize that at this point in time. And everyone sees this as legitimate. Everyone wants energy bills to be relatively frozen. There was a sort of technocratic solution that was going to try and get the borrowing off the books. That was the one that was put forward by the energy companies. That was to say, look, you don't have to just say we're going to borrow and cover this. What we're going to do is we're going to have the energy companies borrow this money from the government, or government-backed loans at least, and then we're going to have our consumers pay back this debt that they've accrued via a levy over 10 to 20 years. Now, that's what was briefed this morning. I can imagine Rishi Sunak would have run with that for a couple of weeks at least. And that would have really politicized this, because then you would have had the Labour Party saying, look, we don't think consumers should pay. We think the big energy companies should pay via a windfall tax. And I think Labour would have won that argument. Now Labour are in a slightly more difficult position, because the argument is between a windfall tax paying for it and borrowing paying for it. And between borrowing and a windfall tax, I don't think people care. Between a levy on their bills and a windfall tax, people really will care. So to me, this does seem like smart politics from Liz Truss and her team from Kwasi Kwarteng. And I do think that Rishi Sunak might have screwed this one up, because I mean, he kind of did over and over again when it came to this policy, because one, for a long time, he was opposing the windfall tax, and he wasn't neutralizing it by saying, look, it's fine, we'll just borrow it. He kept saying, you ordinary people are going to have to pay. People didn't like that. So this, to me, these seem like kind of canny operators, even if Liz Truss, at least when she speaks, she doesn't really come across as one. And maybe that is because they're so flexible. Tax cuts for you guys in big business, spending for you guys who don't have businesses, will go into massive debt, but who really cares? Like, that's probably a winning coalition, isn't it? I mean, let's say they're still behind in the polls, and I don't think the NHS, that's why I think actually instead of the bills, it will be the NHS that really screws them over, because I don't think that kind of having cake and eat it thing will work when it comes to something as serious as the health service, because you can't do these sort of magic tricks when it comes to something that complex and something where investment has to be in a really long-term strategic sense. I'm not convinced they're up for that.
So I think there's 3 parts to this, Michael. The first is what we talked about, in intervention in energy bills, freezing prices. I think you're right. If this is executed even remotely like it seems it will be, it'll be very popular, like furlough. And of course, she has awful ratings right now. Even I think a majority of Tory supporters don't think she'll solve the cost of living crisis. If you turn that round, wow, you're going to get tremendous plaudits. And you're talking about a winning coalition. That's the first part. The second part is the social crisis. We touched upon that just, very briefly. The fact that you have thousands of tons of raw sewage being pumped into waterways, basically every day. The fact that you have a 59-minute wait for an ambulance when it's meant to be 18 minutes. The fact that, the NHS increasingly just doesn't function. The housing market, again, supremely dysfunctional. Education, we're seeing, for instance, little things like the students that applied to the University of Manchester are now being housed in Liverpool because there's been sort of bureaucratic screw-ups. It increasingly feels, from energy to water to universities to public transport, that the system is really creaking. It's not really working properly. And that can deepen very quickly. So that's the social crisis. I don't think she'll get on top of that, by the way. She can maybe pull a few levers and maybe the whole thing doesn't fall apart in the next year. That's probably the best they can hope for. Then the final part, Michael, you're talking about that winning coalition. And I think this is actually important as the first part for Tory voters, is interest rates. And I think if we see interest rates beyond 5, 6, 7%, the Bank of England, by the way, says that the country can basically sustain interest rates of 5 to 7%. That's their estimate. At which point, after 7%, it's going to have massive implications in terms of repossessions and economic growth and so on. I think in real terms, actually, it's probably significantly lower than that. What the Tories will be doing, though, however, is if they freeze energy bills, it will buy them a little bit more capital at the Bank of England to increase interest rates because people are less squeezed elsewhere and they just acknowledge this is something you have to do. So I think if interest rates stay at 5% or below, and they nail, like you say, the energy thing, and the social crisis doesn't really come home to roost, I agree with you. There is a coalition there. Finally, the Tories, and this is very hard, I think, for the left to understand, the Tories, no matter how bad things get, have a certain flaw. If interest rates stay low and house prices either stay the same or rise, because for homeowners, easy credit means you can do your kitchen, it means you can do your attic, it means you can take some holidays, it means you can get that new car on tick on HP. You can get some lovely hybrid SUVs, Michael, now, 300 quid a month. If you can get the credit, you're living a decent lifestyle. But once those house prices start to go down and that easy credit is harder to access, then those people are going to get kind of worried. That's the thing that has greased all of the last 12 years in particular, particularly austerity. Even during austerity, cheap credit and rising house prices was just enough to make just enough people happy to vote Tory. Cameron won a majority in 2015. So I think you're right. If you look at their coalition, those are the three things that matter. And I think if they get two of the three right, they have a shot. And I think that is being underestimated right now by Labour and by the left. That's not to say the Tories are going to win a majority in the next election, because they are facing a staggering political in-tray. But if you sort of disaggregate the problems, you can begin to see how they navigate this, I think.
Before the fanfare of Liz Truss entering Downing Street, Boris Johnson had one last moment in the limelight. I imagine he was a little disappointed it happened at 7:30 a.m. That was because both he and Liz Truss needed time to travel to meet the Queen in Balmoral. But as the nation ate their breakfast, this is what he said.
On the subject of bouncing around in future careers, let me say that I am now like one of those booster rockets that has fulfilled its function, and I will now be gently re-entering the atmosphere and splashing down invisibly in some remote and obscure corner of the Pacific. And like Cincinnatus, I am returning to my plough, and I will be offering this government nothing but the most fervent support. I'll tell you why, this is a tough time for the economy. This is a tough time for families up and down the country. We can and we will get through it, and we will come out stronger the other side. But I say to my fellow Conservatives, it's time for politics to be over, folks. It's time for us all to get behind Liz Truss and her team and her programme and deliver for the people of this country.
Aaron, what did you make of Boris Johnson's speech? I mean, it wasn't particularly humble. He often sounded a little bit bitter at times, saying the rules got changed, that's why I have to get kicked out. I've actually had all of these achievements. Also, it was at 7:30 a.m., which is kind of surreal. What did you make of it? Your initial thoughts?
I thought the lines just quoted there were quite funny. The whole thing about being a booster rocket, that comes down to it. It's quite an apt metaphor, although boost to what precisely? Sort of economic meltdown. What was the destination? I think also tying in what Truss said about her predecessor, you can paint, I think, any prime minister in a certain light if you want to. Ukraine war, COVID, Brexit, defeating Corbyn. And actually, for 3 years, if you're a Tory who was really crapping themselves, the prospect of a socialist Labour government in 2018, that's probably quite, you probably would have taken that. It's really hard to say, Michael, because, if you go over the Sunday papers, if you read the Mail on Sunday, the Times, the Telegraph, the Mail on Sunday, I mean, they are talking openly about Boris Johnson, re-emerging on the front line of politics at some point in the next kind of 5 to 10 years. They genuinely believe that's going to happen. And of course, it is important to remember, Michael, that Cincinnatus, this reference he gave, who I believe was a Roman general, he was called to fulfill his duty to his was it the Roman Republic or the Empire? I can't remember, but to Rome. And then he went back to his humble farming. I mean, what's Boris Johnson going back to precisely? I mean, he's going to write lots of books which keep him in the public eye and make lots of money. I mean, it doesn't seem particularly humble. I mean, I don't think he's going to go on some farm and start picking blackberries or growing asparagus. So the metaphors are quite funny, as ever with Boris Johnson. But I think his next move will be quite interesting, because this is an interesting phenomenon, actually, just generally, Michael, with aging societies, because you have politicians who leave office and then don't go anywhere. Look at Barack Obama. He's a young guy. He's still going to be around a really long time. He still has to do stuff. Tony Blair. I mean, David Cameron's so disgraced, he has to, of course, live in his little shepherd's hut in the Cotswolds. But, that's the exception. And so I think Boris Johnson eventually, maybe not in 6 months or a year, but I think eventually will start causing problems for his party. I think that's just inevitable. He's an ambitious man. He likes the limelight, and he has many opinions on things. So we will see. Although if he can keep his gob shut and not draw too much attention to himself for 6 months, I think you'd be doing Liz Truss a big favour.
I want to go back to this Cincinnatus fella. I mean, I'm not a classics expert. I hadn't heard of him before. I'm not James Butler. But I did go on Wikipedia today. I found it fairly entertaining. So this is their introduction. Cincinnatus was an opponent of the rights of the plebeians, so that's the common citizens, who fell into poverty because of his son Caeso Quinctius's violent opposition to their desire for a written code of equally enforced laws. So he's comparing himself to someone who's viciously opposed to laws being enforced equally. Then it goes on. Despite his old age, Cincinnatus worked his own small farm until an invasion prompted his fellow citizens to call for his leadership. He came from his plough to assume complete control over the state, but upon achieving a swift victory in only 16 days, relinquished his power and its prerequisites and returned to his farm. His success and immediate resignation of his near absolute authority with the end of this crisis, traditionally dated to 458 BC, has often been cited as an example of outstanding leadership, service to the greater good, civic virtue, humility, and modesty. So yeah, the thing that most people have been focused on, as you pointed out there, Aaron, is that this dude Cincinnatus, after resigning, then returned to power. But I do think the qualities that Boris Johnson seems to think he has are fairly entertaining here as well. So he thinks that his resigning, he was given all of this power, which he was, and then he used it for a swift victory. And then he was so honorable, so morally upstanding, so virtuous that he decided to resign of his own accord. And I do feel like that is the image Boris Johnson wants to paint of himself. Is that how he's going to be remembered in history? Is this what Boris Johnson's Wikipedia page will look like in centuries to come, Aaron?
I mean, it is interesting, right? This is the image that I think he believes this, by the way, and that he wants to project the idea of, and it was the Roman Republic, it's before Augustus. And this is, I think, referred to by Cicero. He talks about Cincinnatus as the kind of prototypical, this is the perfect example of a citizen who steps up. Because in Roman Republican thought, the idea is res publica res populi, the public good is the people's thing, and every citizen is capable of this virtue. And of course, the more virtuous citizens, the more powerful the republic. And Cincinnatus is a very good example of a very virtuous citizen. This is the complete opposite. A republic, by the way, huh? A republic. This is the complete opposite of what we presently have. We have a monarchy, although it's a superficial difference. Let's just park that for a moment. Where the political elite are a professional, permanent political elite. It's a very different setup. You might say, well, the lessons of Cincinnatus are very applicable to 2nd century Athens, where, democratic Athens, where you have, you have democracy by lot. Okay. And basically anybody can rule, and we have to have a very, of course, just males with property can rule. And, you need widespread virtue. And of course, everybody needs to do their bit. We have a profoundly different way of doing politics in the 21st century in the West, which is we have a specialized political elite, although they're not really specialized at very much apart from enriching themselves and screwing things up, it seems. who are deeply enmeshed with financial and media power. That's how politics works, a set of revolving doors between newspapers, TV channels, like I say, professional political bag carriers, and economic and financial wealth. Entirely different to the world that I think Boris Johnson genuinely appears to think that he's a part of. But maybe political theory is a conversation that legacy media isn't really ready for, Michael. Maybe Joe Lycett taking the piss out of Laura Kuenssberg is the best we can hope for now. But maybe one day James Butler will be explaining, Ciceronian Republican thoughts on the Sunday Politics show hosted by Ash Sarkar. One can only hope.
Let's wrap up there. Of course, we will be back tomorrow, so there will be lots more detail for you then. Thank you so much, Aaron. Been a pleasure being joined by you on a Tuesday for a change.
My pleasure, Michael. And isn't it great we're doing a nightly show this week? I think we're maybe doing one on Thursday as well.
I think it depends how big the news is on Thursday. If it turns out that the proper energy plan isn't announced until Thursday, we'll definitely do one on Thursday, because as we say, this is the big deal right now. We shall confirm tomorrow, I imagine. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.